All right. I'm going to be talking about technology and digging into some of the more techy training things today. And then next month, Scott and I will be talking about strength and flexibility, and then Scott will finish it up in May, going over race strategy and how to race to your potential. So what I wanted to cover today was basically talk about how to get faster. So I wanted to look at how you can lower resistance, primarily on the bike, how you can increase power to be able to put more power out and go faster, how to be more efficient with the power that you have, and then also look at some of the training aids of how to monitor your performance and how to review your racing and training to learn about the mistakes you made and how to improve next time. So first I wanted to take a little bit on swimming, and hopefully you guys can see this fine. It's a little small, but wetsuits are one of the easy ways to cheat while you swim and basically go faster without having to work harder. Wetsuits have been found to give you between 3 to 7% increase in efficiency. The nice thing is, the weaker swimmer, you get more of a benefit. So if you're not very good at swimming, you have poor form, your legs sink, you don't rotate very well, your wetsuit is really going to help that. It also helps the people that have really low body fat that sink. It'll keep you up higher in the water. And also for colder water, it makes a huge difference. Water pulls the heat out of your body about 25 times faster than air. So if you're in cold water for more than 10-15 minutes, having a wetsuit will really help you when you get on the bike, not being too cold. There's two types. There's the sleeveless and the full sleeve. The sleeveless is a little slower. You lose about 1% of the speed, but it is a lot easier to get in and out and find the right fit. A full-length suit, you got to be really careful that your arms and shoulders fit correctly. Otherwise, you're going to get some extra resistance and a lot of times extra rubbing and irritation. Drafting while swimming is legal, unlike biking, and you get a huge improvement. So on the studies they've done, they found an 18 to 25% improvement, which is huge on the swim. The problem is it's really hard to do because most of the time you're in dirty water, so you can't see the person next to you that well. So you end up running into them or zigzagging, where you look up and you're way over on this side, and you look up and you're on the other side. So it's difficult, but if you can do it, it makes a huge difference, and you can shave off a number of minutes on your normal Olympic or half Ironman distance swim. Now, if you see how these three people are drafting off this person, they're not drafting directly behind, because when they're kicking, they're adding a lot of turbulence, where that is not a very good draft zone. You actually want to be right up along their side, right next to their hip, is where you have the best draft. You can basically see the bow wave that's coming off from their head and shoulders and heading straight out, and you want to tuck in right in there. Of course, you are right next to their feet, so you got to be a little careful of that, and you will get kicked a few times, but if you can get this down and find the right person to draft during a race, it can make a huge difference. All right, so let's go to biking. Most people are going to have a road bike or a tri-bike. If you're starting out in triathlons, a road bike is a decent starting place. It's easy to use, but it's not very fast. It's very much designed for group riding, where you're not very aerodynamic and you're sitting up relatively straight, where you're getting a lot of wind resistance being hit. Now, you can go down into drops like this guy is, but then you're having to support your whole upper body with your tricep muscles, and after your swim, you're usually pretty fatigued and you can't hold that for very long. So most people are going to put aero bars in their road bike, and this will usually give you between 20 and 25% improvement in speed. So it's well worth the $100 to $150 of putting those on your road bike. Though the main downside of this is you're not having your hands on your shifters. So you can see he's in the middle on his aero bars, but he can't shift. So as you go up and down hills, you're basically having to reach over to shift your bike, and you're going to spend a lot of time in a cadence that's either too slow or too fast of where you optimally want to be. But it's a great way of starting. I did this the first probably 3-4 races, and it works well. So what most people want to get to eventually is get to a tri-specific bike. It's going to be your fastest option. You're going to have your shifters where you can shift a dozen times a minute or even more in some courses. So you're going to be able to really key into your perfect cadence and power that you want to put in. One thing you do have to worry about is you're weighted quite a bit forward on your front wheel. So on slow speeds, it's relatively unstable. So it does take a little bit to get used to. All right, so let's go into bike form. Now, if you look on your normal race, you're going to see a lot of different types of people and how they fit on their bike. I have two examples here. One over here is extremely aggressive form, where the guy is almost parallel to the ground and is in a very fast aerodynamic position. And then I have a guy doing Ironman who's in a much more relaxed position. It's going to be a lot more comfortable, but he's not going to be able to go as fast because there's a lot more wind resistance that he's having to fight through. It's really a personal decision of how aerodynamic you want to get. Starting out, you're not going to be able to just go into this very aerodynamic position and be able to handle that for more than a few minutes at a time. It's one of those things where it's going to take months to even years to really build the body strength and flexibility to be able to go into that position. Also, when your goal start right away into an aerodynamic position like that, you're not going to have a lot of power. It's one of those things that you're really going to have to train and build that muscle strength up in that position. Aerodynamics is important for everybody, not just slow people, just really fast people above 25 miles an hour. The slower people are going to have less wind resistance per minute, but they are going to be out there longer. So that slower resistance, that lower resistance is going to add up over the whole bike. All right, so let's look at air resistance. The resistance becomes the major force around 10 to 12 miles an hour. So I have a graph here where here's around 10 miles an hour, and the red line is just your normal friction from your wheels, bearings, and chain, and then we have the black line here is a time trial bike in an aero position, and then the top line here is a road bike. So you can see that starting at 10 miles an hour, there's not much difference. Once you get up to 20 miles an hour, you're seeing quite a bit of difference, and once you get up close to 30, you're starting to see a huge difference between those two bikes. And that's where you're going to have that huge speed increase by going into your aerodynamic position. Now your body makes up most of the drag on the bike, so that's where you want to play around to get the biggest improvements. All right, so I put a list of different things you can do to limit your wind resistance. Your body takes up about 85%, so moving your position on the bike is going to be most important to get faster. Aero helmets can make a big difference. You can see up to around a 7% decrease in drag, and that usually is going to cost you around $100 to $200 depending on what you're going to spend. So that's usually one of the first things that you're going to try to pick up to go faster. Then another cheap way of doing it is working with your clothes, making sure you have tight fitting clothes. If you have anything that flaps in the wind or gaps when you're in the aero position, that's adding a lot of extra drag that is slowing you down, which you really don't want. Again, clip-on bars will give you a 20% decrease in wind drag from just a standard road bike up in the hoods. Bike frame only takes up about 25%, 15 to 25% of your total drag, depending if you're aero position or a road bike setup. So there's really not a lot of improvement going to a new frame that you can get. You're probably talking about maybe 10% of your total going from the worst frame to the best, and that's going to cost you a lot of money. Usually tri-bike is going to be in the $15,000 to $5,000 or even $10,000 range, depending on what you want to spend. Wheels are another thing that are relatively expensive and give you limited return. They take up anywhere from 6 to 16, 17% of your total drag in most setups. Going to a deep dish wheel will save you a large percentage of drag, so they've seen 60% decrease. A disc wheel, you can get up to 70%. But again, you're spending a lot of money. So most of these wheels are going to run anywhere from $500 to $2,000, depending on the different types. If you're going zip, or some of the off-brand types. Also, your deep dish wheels and disc wheels can have a disadvantage on windy days where you're actually going to get a negative benefit with the wind drag. So your best bet is working on body position on the bike and playing around with clothing, aero helmet, and really working on your position. You can buy speed, but you have to spend a lot of money to get it. So there's usually better ways of becoming faster. All right, there's also rolling resistance. As you saw in the graph before, that is relatively static, where it doesn't increase or decrease that much depending how fast you're going. But it does make a difference. So there's a couple different ways that you can change how much rolling resistance you have. Mainly it's the type of tires you use and how you inflate them. So most people just have a standard training tire that they spend most of their time on. Now those tires are designed to be long-lasting, where you get a lot of miles on them, 2,000–3,000 miles, and they're designed to be puncture-proof. So they're going to have a barrier layer of Kevlar or Vector or some other flexible but very strong material. Now this makes it harder to flat them, so the rocks and wires and nails have a harder time going through, but it also makes the flexibility a lot less. So it takes more strength and power to move those tires. Race tires, on the other hand, are not designed to be very strong, they're designed to be very fast. So they're made out of thin material, you usually don't have a lot of rubber that the training tires have on, and they're easy to puncture, and you gotta be relatively careful when you race with them. So a training tire, you can run over just about anything. You can go gravel roads at 30 miles an hour and nothing bad usually happens. Race tires, you really have to watch in front of you and not run over anything, because there's a pretty high chance that you can puncture. There's actually some cases where some of the elite racers that are doing 20K races will get the special tires that you can only race one time and throw them away with. And those are super fast that basically have no resistance on them. But you have to have on a swept course with nothing that could puncture. One thing to keep in mind is the tire inflation. Most tires will tell you the inflation they should be, and you really shouldn't go that much above them. When you overinflate a tire, you would think it cuts down on the rolling resistance, but it really doesn't. Once you get up to that 100 PSI range, anything above that doesn't help very much. It's basically getting closer and closer to not helping at all. And when it's a very high pressure, you're not deforming to all the bumps and trash that's on the road, and you're actually, every time you hit something, your bike goes straight up and then over, and that results in your momentum being slowed down, where you're going to have to add more power to speed your bike back up. So having your tires at normal pressure will usually be fastest. Most of the time you will drop your pressure a few pounds on wet roads so you don't skid out. Also, it's usually best to have your front tire a few PSI lower. You have more weight on your back tire, so you need it pumped up higher. And having a little more grip on your front tire helps cornering and going down hills where you have a little more control.
Mike, what do you ride on?
What do I ride on for training tires or race tires? It depends. I've been switching around and trying out quite a few this last year. It's a really, I understand why most people won't give a recommendation, because tires and punctures are very random. So you could have the best race tire in the world and just be unlucky and flat out. But at the same time, you could have a great training tire and never flat. So I use Grand Prix 4000s as my training tire. They have great puncture resistance, and I usually get 2,000 to 2,500 miles. And there's been some years where I've burned through 2 sets and never had a flat. I've also had, 2 years ago, I think it was 5 rides in a row where I flatted on those tires. So it's really random of where you get flats and where you don't. Last year I was playing around with the Bontrager's race wheels, and those worked well. I'm probably going to try a different tire this year. So
why not?
Right. The idea is you keep playing around to find a tire that you think is best. And but at the same point, you have to make a personal decision of how fast you want to go versus how safe you want to be. So if you're doing Ironman and you just want to finish, you might just want to grab a safe tire that you don't want to have to worry about changing. But if you're trying to shave off a couple minutes and make it to Kona, then it may be worth racing a pretty light tire that has a chance of flatting, but you're probably going to shave off 5-8 minutes on your bike course. So it's really deciding how much risk you want to take and how light of a race tire you're willing to ride on. Also, race tires are expensive and usually are only going to race them one season, and then you wear them out and get a new pair. Because race tires, once you get very many miles on them, the chance of puncturing becomes much higher because you basically wore through that very thin rubber. But yeah, good question. All right, so I have a case study of doing Got Energy the last 2 years. So I have a bunch of pictures of myself up here. So if you can't tell, yes, that's actually me. So this here is 2011 on my Ironman course. This is where I'm trying to tweak my form and get ready for Got Energy last year. So if you can kind of see here, you can see my form is quite a bit different. You can see my elbows are sticking out quite a bit farther, so I'm having extra drag on my elbows into my shoulders. And you can also see quite a bit of my jersey here, and my jersey puffing up and moving around a bit. Over here, you can see my elbows are much tighter in. I basically brought my arms in and closed that gap to make myself more aerodynamic. Also down here, I don't know if you can see this very well, but I'm actually getting a custom fitting of my jersey to make myself more aerodynamic. And then up here, you can see that I've really dropped my back where I've gotten close to parallel to the ground on my bottom. I'm still having a bit of an arch, but I'm working trying to get more aerodynamic. So how much do you think that would actually improve making the change? You can also see the bike color change, so that is a different bike also. So let's look at what changed. So in 2011, I have power tap data. So I put out a normalized a 273. For 2012, I was actually down and put 264 since I couldn't train as much with an injury. And then my average is also down about 7 points, 7 watts. So I put out less energy, a decent amount of less energy on the race, but I actually sped up quite a bit. I gained 1.25 miles by putting out less effort by just changing my body position and how I fit on the bike. So by changing things up, you can get a lot faster and work less hard, which is what everybody really wants to do. So doing this, if I did the same speed, I would probably be close to 1.5 miles faster. Now the 2 years, last year was actually a much windier course and a lot harder. So actually these numbers will probably be higher if we had comparable bike numbers. I wasn't able to get anyone else to give me their power numbers to kind of compare, but just based on looking at some of the results year to year and kind of how I felt it was, I would say these numbers are low to what on the same course as what it would be.
What was your body weight difference?
Body weight difference, I was actually probably a couple pounds higher this year, simply because I hadn't trained much.
No, it's your Ironman?
No, this has Got Energy.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could do that once at Ironman, I would be awesome. I would be all pro, yes. So this is over 24 miles or something like that. But yeah, that's a good question about weight. But yeah, I was actually heavier on this side, so again, that might have raised it up 10th of a point or something.
The new bike didn't make a difference, much of a difference?
I would say no. It was similar aerodynamics, so both of them were an aero frame. The main thing was my body position. So the bike itself, I would probably not say it was more than maybe a percentage, maybe a little more. Most of it was how I fit on the bike. I fit much better on that bike and was able to be in a lot more aggressive position. But again, it's hard to be able to actually take that bike out without measuring it. But just based on it, that bike is a full carbon bike, but it actually is a year or two older than the bike I had. So the aerodynamics should have been relatively similar. All right, so let's go to cadence. Cadence is actually very important in triathlons. Faster cadence is better. There's a couple different reasons for that. One is when you have a slow cadence, you're having to put a lot more pressure on each pedal stroke. So what that's doing is you're usually running out of your slow twitch muscle fibers when you're pushing down the pedals on a slow cadence, that 50, 60 RPMs. And so you're having to recruit your fast twitch muscle fibers, which is going to result in you burning less fat and putting more fatigue and burning up your stores that you have in your muscles. Also, you're putting a lot more stress on your joints, your knees. A lot of people that have any sort of knee issues are going to have those start to crop up. You're putting more stress on your muscles, less on your heart and lungs, your cardiovascular system, and that is going to come back on the run because you're trying to protect the run as much as possible. If you do faster, so if you do that 80 to 100, it's usually the sweet spot is right around the 85 to 95. It's going to lessen the stress for each pedal stroke. So you're going to be using almost all slow twitch muscles. It's also going to feel easier in most cases. Also, one of the big things is it's close to where you should be running off the bike. So one thing that's very difficult, if you pedal very slow, let's say you pedal an 80 cadence on the bike for 5, 6, 7 hours in the Ironman, when you get off and try to run on your normal cadence, which is, for me, I think it's like 87, 88, it's very hard for your body that's used to going on a slow cadence to speed up and be able to run at the fast cadence. So what you're going to find is your cadence is going to slow down, you're going to get off the kind of running groove that you normally expect to have, and it's really going to be a fight to keep your cadence up all the way through the run. And your run is going to feel much harder. The other thing is you're trying to protect your legs as much as possible. So any stress that you can do on your cardiovascular system, which is designed to take stress for long periods, is going to help your run. You're going to have a lot less cramping, a lot less pain in your legs, and be able to run a lot faster.
You said your race cadence is like 87-ish?
Yeah. I'm usually trying to hit 90, but my run cadence is usually going to be in that 87, 88. For biking, I try to hit right around 90. It doesn't always happen. I tend to feel I'm most powerful in the low to mid 80s, and that's something I'm trying to teach myself to bike faster. And because I can really feel a run that if I spin relatively fast, I run much better off the bike. Now, if I was just doing a straight time trial with no run afterward, then I would definitely lower my cadence probably in the second half of the bike to get the most power possible out. But again, that would trash your legs and you would not be running afterwards. So it's one of those things that you do have to train your body, and when you first start spinning fast, especially if you're used to just grinding out your bike ride, you are going to feel less strong, and it's going to take a while for you to build that strength up.
So would you say when you're riding, like training rides, would you keep that cadence going on your training?
Yes, yep. I would spend as much time as possible on the race cadence. That's where you want to be, where you want to build your strength and endurance, and really get your body used to it, so you don't even have to think about it. You're just pedaling, and that's the cadence you're always at. I mean, you can do a few workouts where you might do a big gear workout where you're really stressing the low cadence. You might do some spinning training where you might be in that 110, 120 trying to work on a really smooth pedal stroke, but most of your work should be right at that 90 range. And it does depend. Different people will find slightly different speeds that work best for them, but the vast majority will find that right around 90 is optimal. For bike racing, actually, I'll be closer to 100 in a lot of cases, just for some of the benefits there. All right, so now that we found out the cadence that we want to do, a lot of people don't have their bikes geared where they can keep in that cadence in most of the terrain they'll be racing at. So depending on your race, you're going to want to have different gearing. There's some gearing that will work for everything, some gears that are really set up for a very flat course. So if you're doing Bryce Prairie over the 24 miles, I think there's 150 feet of climb or something like that. So there's really no reason to have a huge range of gears. But if you're in Ironman Wisconsin, there's around 4,000 feet of climbing there. And there's some relatively steep hills. So having the right gearing so that you can spin up the hills and not get down where you're having to crank on the pedals at the 30 or 40 RPM will really help your run afterwards. So there's two ways to change your gearing. You can change the crank, which is the front part, or you can change the rear cassette, or you can change both. There's two standard types of cranks. You have kind of the old school standard one, which is a bigger crank, and then you have a compact crank, which has a lot of race bikes are now having some variation of this. What it does, it allows you to climb better, but it doesn't give you quite the same top end speed. But now that they've come out with some of the 11-based rear cassettes, you can now get very similar speeds as using a standard crank with a compact crank. So you can do the math, calculate the ratios, you can just ask someone and say what's going on, or what I find the easiest is just go out and climb and see how fast you can climb at the cadence that you want to hold. So if you go climb S and you're climbing at 4 miles an hour and your cadence is like 20, then you probably want to change your gearing so that you can spin up it a little easier. Again, you want to have the least amount of pressure on the pedals when you're pedaling so that when you get off the bike, you're going to be able to run well. So I threw up a couple of charts just because I like these. We're not really going to study these too much. What we really want to care about is two numbers. So the high number of 39.6 is kind of your max pedaling speed on the flat, and this is for your standard crank with a smaller rear cassette, 11 by 22. And that's kind of what the old style size gearing that a lot of the pro racers have. And if you're not on EPO and you don't have 2% body fat, it usually doesn't work very well for everybody. So if we drop down into 60 RPMs, which is kind of what a lot of people are going to end up climbing, you have to climb at 8 miles an hour. So if you guys think about a hill you're climbing, 8 miles an hour is going pretty fast. In an Ironman, most people won't want to be climbing that fast. So if we put on a bigger rear cassette, 11 by 28, we find that at 60 RPMs, we've dropped down to 6.5 miles an hour. So we can now climb a mile and a half slower at the same cadence. We also find that if we wanted to keep it around 8 miles an hour, we can now spin at 75 RPMs, which is going to take a lot of extra stress off your knees, your quads, and everything else. So playing around with gearing and finding the gearing that's going to allow you to spin up the different hills that you're going to be racing on can make a huge difference and help you run better off the bike. And they're called granny gears, and don't feel bad. People laugh at me, but then when I beat up the hill, they don't usually say too much afterwards. All right, so next we want to talk about pedaling. Pedaling, you can kind of look at it as 360 degrees of putting power down on the pedals, and most people do a really good job in the first 80 degrees. This is the power stroke where most people put the most power on the pedals. Most people kind of forget and basically don't do anything in the second half. But this is actually a relatively important place to do. So most people, they just basically let their leg relax, and the other side of the pedal that's now in the power zone is going to lift that dead weight up and back around. But what we know is a leg weighs 15 to 20 pounds. So when you're pushing down really hard with your quad, you're having a lot of extra dead weight that you're fighting. So that's extra energy that you're putting down to lift that leg up. If you use your small secondary muscles to pull that pedal back and then lift it up, and you really don't have to pull that hard, the main thing is just to on-weight that leg so that other power stroke is not having to lift it, you're now putting a lot less stress on your quads. And again, your quads are going to be used on the run, and you want to protect them as much as possible. So if you can spread out the amount of work onto your whole leg and not just your quads, you're going to run much better afterwards. So if you're actually looking at it, they found with pro cyclists that they were able to get between 60 and 90% increase in power in short durations. We're going from just using the power stroke to using the whole cycle. A couple of good drills just to make sure you're doing this is a one-legged drill. We just pop one foot out and then use the other one, do cycles of 20 or 30, and really focus on pulling back and lifting up, and really focus on that. Then do the other leg, and then put them together. And usually when I'm biking, every 10-15 minutes, I will think about what I'm doing and really making sure I'm lifting up and working. This is a little harder when you're in the arrow position, because when you're bent over, it just makes lifting that leg a little harder. So you do have to focus on this and make sure you're doing it, especially when you get tired near the end of a ride. All right, here we get extra weight, the fun thing. So weight does make a big difference. It makes a difference everywhere on the run. So every step you make, you are having some vertical travel where you are lifting your body up and coming down. They've done some studies where over 40 minutes, someone climbed over 600 feet of elevation just by the little bounce in their step. So having a couple extra pounds does add a lot into your quads and your calves having to lift it up. Here's a few numbers where dropping 5 pounds save 30 seconds in a 5K, 10 pounds for 60 seconds. When you're doing a marathon or the run in the Ironman, that weight does make a huge difference. Also dealing with heat. So every bit of insulation you can remove from your body is going to help you survive those hot July, August races and not get dehydrated quite as fast. For the bike, you don't see as much of an improvement on the flat. Basically, your rolling resistance is not going to change much. Gaining or losing 5-10 pounds, you're going to see a huge difference in the climb. So you're going to gain around 1.5 watts for every pound of weight that you gain. Also air resistance. So every bit of fat you lose on your body makes you thinner, and thinner goes through the air faster. So you will cut down on wind drag. So, but no one really measures that, but it's pretty easy to see that happen. Because if you spend $2,000-3,000 to go to a round tube bike to an arrow tube bike, you can cut that amount of drag just by losing a few pounds. So again, weight is not just losing weight, it's losing fat. So if you drop 5 pounds and you drop muscle weight, you're actually going to get slower. But if you're actually dropping dead weight that is not helping you to propel fat forward, then that's where you're going to see the improvement. So when you're losing weight, make sure you're doing it smartly, where you're actually losing the fat and dead weight, and not where you're destroying muscles and other things, where you're just trying to lose water weight. That won't help you get faster. All right, so now let's go into the technology and how that can help you racing. So this is probably my favorite part of training and racing. There's a lot of different ways that you can get faster. One of the ways is simply being able to review your training and racing and find out what you did wrong, what you did well, how well you were able to hold the paces you were targeting. There's a couple different ways to measure how you're doing. We're going to look at a few different ones. All right, so first we're going to talk about running before we go into biking, which is something I've done a lot with. Running, I found the GPS is the best way to pace yourself. Heart rate is good to train in different zones. So if you wanted to train in zone 2, zone 3, zone 5, but it's very difficult to actually pace well with a heart rate. And we'll get in a little more into that, but I found GPS is what I work best with. One of the nice things is you can do interval training anywhere. So you don't have to go to a measured track or a measured area. You can just push the button, your GPS, take off, and half a mile later you push it again and you see how fast you are. There's some nice tools like a VDOT calculator, which you can put in your race numbers, and they can calculate you your best intervals for quarter miles, half miles, mile repeats of where the intensity is going to help you grow, but not too high where the chance of injury is raised. There's a lot of nice tools to do this. There's a Garmin Forerunner series, which I have. I have the 405, which has worked very well. They also have triathlon-specific ones, like the 310 and the 910, which allow you to swim, bike, and run with the same watch instead of having to have separate technology. All right, so let's go into pacing on the bike. Now, biking is much harder to pace because there's so many different variables. While you're running at a relatively slow pace where wind resistance, other than a very windy day, really doesn't affect much. Biking, it makes a huge difference. So a lot of people try to pace by perceived effort, so how hard it feels. I'm going to go out and bike at a high intensity, I'm going to go and just spin and go easy. And that's really hard to gauge how well you're actually doing. During a race, you're going to have that adrenaline feeling at the start where everything feels really easy, even though you might be running a 5:30 mile or a 6-minute mile. And also during a long race like Ironman, you're going to have those peaks and valleys where you feel great 1 minute and then the next minute you feel like walking and throwing up in a corner somewhere. So very few people can do it. Scott can actually do it very well. I can't do this at all. I go full power until I tip over. So not a very good way of pacing for me. The second one, which a lot of people do, is by miles per hour. Most people have a little bike computer, they watch it, they try to stick and hit their miles. So if they're going to race and they want to do 19 miles an hour, they're going to watch that mile an hour average at the end and make sure they hit it no matter what. Again, that's very difficult. There's so many things that influence miles. I mean, miles per hour. If you put on race wheels, then you're going to go faster for less effort. Same with wind or climbing. And a lot of times in a false flat that's only a 1 or 2% grade, you can't really tell you're climbing, but it's going to be a lot harder, and you're going to work much higher than you should be. So it's very, very hard to race consistently with just miles per hour. So next we're going to heart rate. So heart rate has a ton of science behind it, and it works very well for certain things. It doesn't work very well for pacing during racing and pacing during some of the high-intensity, shorter events. So heart rate measures the stress on your cardiovascular system. It doesn't measure the stress that you're actually putting out. So if you're putting power to the pedals, we're not actually measuring that. We're measuring how your body is responding to the power that you're putting down. And there's a lot of issues with training straight with heart rate. One of the problems is it's delayed. So if you start doing an interval, let's say we're going to do 5-minute bike intervals, the first 30 seconds to a minute and a half, your heart is still catching up to that new intensity. It really hasn't caught up and stabilized to that new intensity that you're riding at. So you really don't know where you are. And if you make corrections, either going harder or easier to catch up with your heart rate, you're now going to have to wait another half minute to a minute to see if you pick the right speed. So it's very difficult that way. Also, we find the zones change on the bike on the run. So when you're running upright, your heart has to pump a lot more blood higher. When you're in the aero position, your heart doesn't have to pump blood as far, and it's going to have a different heart rate zone than you would expect. Also, there's a lot of things that affect heart rate. Caffeine, sleep, anxiety, everything has different influences. I know a couple years ago I tried to use 5-hour energy with racing, and that is definitely not a good thing to do. So I chugged down one of those containers about 15 minutes before I did an hour time trial, and I thought I was going to die about halfway in. I think my heart rate stood at about 180 the whole time, and I finally just pulled my heart rate down and just spiked. It was one of those things I would never ever do again. Yeah, so don't try it. I was dumb enough to try just a half shot the next time, and then I just gave it up. So, another couple issues is drifting. Your heart rate does drift in longer events. So in an Ironman, if you're watching heart rate, especially in the middle of the run and end of the run, you're going to find that how hard and fast you're going is going to be different for the same heart rate. So your heart rate will either drift up where it gets faster and you might be going the same speed, or your heart rate usually is going to get tired and start to slow down. So it's kind of hard to judge later in the race. Also, measuring fitness. Your heart rate doesn't change that much once you become a certain level of fitness, so it's really hard to tell if you're getting stronger or not during the season. Alright, so here's what I think is the best way of training, of course, after looking at heart rate. It's power. Power measures exactly what you're doing. So when you're putting power down the pedals, you can measure exactly to the watt of what you're putting out. It's not affected by outside influences, so it doesn't matter if you didn't get much sleep last night, it doesn't matter if there's a 20-mile headwind, it's what power you're putting to the bike. It's also very easy to chart this information and look at it a week later, a month later, a year later, and really see how you're doing and compare it to not only yourself but other people. There's thousands and thousands of power data from different Ironman, half Ironman, all kinds of different races that people have reviewed and basically showed what they did wrong, what they did right, that you can learn from, and really not have to experience a lot of the negative problems that you can learn from them. There is a few negatives. The one thing is it's kind of expensive. So you're pretty much going to have to start out at around the grand with a lot of systems, 1,500, 2,000 or more. It's also information overload. When I first looked at it, I had no idea what I was looking at, and it took a while to actually be able to dig down into the data and really learn things from it. It's also going to, just like going from nothing to heart rates, you're going to find that what you were training before is really not that scientific. You're not really doing anything right, and you end up having to change a lot of ways you're doing things. All right, so here's a couple different terms when we're looking at power. So you just have the standard power, which is how much power you're putting on the pedals. You have a test where you're going to figure out what your threshold power is, and that's basically what you can put out for 1 hour. And once you find that number, and you're usually going to find that number every month or so, you're going to base all your training on that number as a certain percentage. So you're going to go off intensity factors. So I might be biking at 70% today, or I might be trying to put 100% down, or I'm doing intervals at 120%, things like that. And those numbers, as you gain fitness and your power, your functional threshold rises, those numbers will keep creeping up as a percentage of your functional threshold. So if I'm on-trained right now, my 70% may be 200, but later in the year it might be 220 or 230. And you keep creeping up and really be able to see your improvements. Training stress score is also a very useful tool. That's where it's adding up your rides to see how much stress you have in a certain ride over the week, over the month, over the year. So you can basically keep track of not jumping too much. So you don't go from 300 stress 1 week to 600 stress the next week, but you're making sure you're gradually adding on, and then when you're having your recovery weeks, you're making sure you're actually recovering. So one of the first things I found was I really didn't have any recovery bike rides. I had basically hard bike rides, just different lengths. So finding that out and being able to train a little smarter that way definitely helped. They also have normalized power, which is really looking at your average power, but it's taking into effect the different variables of speeding up, acceleration, working above your threshold to add extra weight to those, since those negatively affect your body and how well you can train. Then we also have variable index, which is basically looking at your average to your normalized power and basically rating how well you're doing. So in a triathlon where you want to have steady state power and basically pick your perfect number and hold that number the whole ride, having these different measurements really help you see how well you did and learn how to be better the next time out. So here's a pacing chart. I hope you can kind of see this. It's a little distorted. But basically it's showing the percentages that you're normally going to ride at different distances. So for a sprint or Olympic bike, you can go from about 90 to 105% of your functional threshold, because you should be able to finish the bike in an hour or a little less. If you go over to an Ironman, you're going to be running at 60 to 70% of your threshold, with the elites being able to run at 70 to 80%. Now the reason an elite can run at a higher percentage of their threshold is because they're able to bike much quicker. So with an age grouper like myself, we can do somewhere around 5.5, 6 hours on the bike. They're doing it around 4.5. So they're putting a lot less, they might be putting more stress out per hour, but they're only doing it maybe 60, 70% as long as we are. So they can put a higher stress for a short amount of time, and they're actually putting about as much stress on their body. So when they get off the run, they're going to be as fresh or fresher than we are. So this chart here just allows you to go how long I'm going to ride an Ironman, and then at what intensity I want to ride at. So like 74% or 73%, and that's basically going to tell you if you're going to be able to run afterwards, based on looking at hundreds and hundreds of people that have used power meters and how well they ran. So basically the dark orange is saying, good luck, you're probably not going to even finish the ride. Light orange is, you're probably going to run a mile and then walk it home. Light is, if you're a strong Ironman, you're probably going to do pretty well and should be able to run it. Dark gray, so this range here is saying you're probably going to leave a little bit on the bike, but you should have a good run. And then we get to the light gray where we're being really conservative on the bike, so we make sure we can run it. So for my example, I was able to bike 5:30 the last Ironman I did, and if I want to try to go light yellow, I would come up and say I can bike at 73%, and I should be able to run well off the bike. And so I can play around that with my bricks and with my training and figure out if that's going to work for me. And then as long as I keep on my goal power and be consistent with where my power is, when I get done, I should be able to run well because I've put a certain amount of stress on my body and I have enough left over to make the run. So it is scientific, but it's really nice to say I can pick a number and I know I'll be able to run versus when you're doing your first Ironman, it's like, I don't know how hard I can push, I'm just going to bike easy and see what happens. Here you can actually try a certain number, depending how it goes, you can then either drop it down so you run better, or if you want to get a little faster, you bump it up 1 or 2% and see what happens. If you're trying to go by perceived effort or speed, there's a good chance you're going to overdo it or underdo it and leave a lot of time on the course or have a 6-7 hour marathon, which we don't want to do. So here's a chart which basically shows the 4 different types of pacing and how you would feel climbing up a hill. So if we climb up a hill at a constant power, your heart rate's going to start and be delayed. So up here on the heart rate, you're going to take a while before your heart rate responds, and then it's going to climb slowly until you stop pedaling and go down. It's going to then stay high for a while and then drop down and catch up with you. Perceived effort, which is this line here, is going to be very similar. It's going to take a while before it hurts. So when you're first starting the hill, you feel good, everything's going great, and pretty soon by the time you get to the middle of the hill, it's starting to feel painful, get a little harder, and by the time you get to the top, it feels just horrible, right? You might want to get off and walk, and then once you start pedaling, everything's good. Now with speed, you're going to slow down, and depending how steep, you're going to be at a different miles per hour. With power, if you do a constant power, nothing changes. You can just look at that number and say, I'm going to climb at 250, and you climb at 250. You don't really have to go off how hard it feels or going off what your heart rate is responding to 30, 60, 90 seconds before. It also makes a big deal when you're climbing well above your threshold, when your heart rate's going to keep climbing, and you really can't key off of that. All right, so there's a few pacing guidelines that really helps you on a race that has hills. First of all, climbing is all power to weight. So if you have a certain power versus how many pounds, that's how good of a climber you are. It's not the strongest person, it's the strongest person for that amount of weight. Since you're climbing at a slow speed, you do want to get out of the saddle. There's no reason, well, not get out of the saddle, but get out of the aero position. There's no reason to stay in the aero position because you are weaker there. So you might as well get up, stretch out, loosen up your back, really open your chest up so you can breathe and get the most power possible. If you're going around 6 miles or below, you basically have no wind resistance. So this is a great time of working a little harder because that extra work is going directly toward moving. There's no loss of energy fighting the wind. That's the same as you get up to around 12 miles an hour. You still want to go slightly above your goal pace. Not a lot where you're actually going to really fatigue yourself, but enough that you're kind of banking a little time. Once you get kind of into your kind of target range of that 12 to 24 miles an hour, you're really just going to want to go at your goal pace. And then once it gets faster than that, you're really going to want to put out less energy because every bit of the energy you're putting out is going toward fighting the wind. So you're really not gaining anything. So when you're going downhill at 30, 40 miles an hour, there's no real reason to be pedaling that hard. You can spin a little bit to keep your legs loose, keep the lactic acid moving out, but there's really no reason to work because 95, 98% of your energy is just fighting the wind and really not going forward. So it's a great time to get as aero as possible and just cruise down. All right, so now let's look into a little bit of software. I also put some numbers on different tools you can get. Again, the best tools are the most expensive, but they're definitely worth having tools that can save your race information so that you can look at it afterwards. And again, being able to have power and GPS really helps a lot if you want to critique how you did on a ride or a run and understand the different variables that affect. So we'll take a look at some of the standard running and biking software tools. All right, so let's look at Strava first. Strava is something that came on the scenes the last year and a half. It's a nice tool that allows you, kind of like Facebook, to connect with the people around you, connect with your friends, kind of see what they do. It does have some nice tools where it will put your route, as long as you have a GPS-enabled device. You can use your phone if you have a smartphone, or if you have like a Garmin. Those things you can upload here, and it'll show you where you are on a map. For example, this is a run that Stefan did yesterday. I found on there. You can see each of his mile splits. You can see how he did. You can get him, say, good job. You can compare routes. If you see a cool route, you can go run it and see if it was as hard as it looked. You can also graph elevation, and you compare results to other people. So I went out and found a segment. This is County II going up south. I was able to find 3 Bluff Busters, Stefan, Jane, and myself, that did this last year. Jane got Queen of the Mountain, I got King of the Mountain. So basically this allows you to grab any chunk of the road and compare it to anyone else and compare it to yourself. So if you're wanting to test how you improve during the year, you would find a segment or make a segment, and then every month you'd go and do that segment and then compare the results and see if you got faster, got slower. It keeps track of heart rate, power, speed. So basically you could say, did my power increase or did my heart rate decrease? So if I did this later in the year and my power stayed the same but my heart rate went down, I'm like, awesome. My cardiovascular fitness just got better. If my power went up and my heart rate stayed similar, it's like, okay, I got stronger. Or if my time actually went up and it took longer, then I'm like, well, something bad happened. So it's a nice way of kind of comparing yourself to others and also comparing yourself to yourself and really seeing if you're getting stronger or not. And with these, you don't need a power meter. You can just do time, especially on a climb where you're going slow enough that wind resistance is really not playing a big factor. So as long as you pick a similar day and do the same thing, you can really see, are you getting stronger or aren't you? I'm doing a time. All right, we're almost done. All right, so this is a 5K race that I did last year, which shows where I made some tactical mistakes, where you can actually see this. So if you're looking here, you can see just my overall time, but you can also see that I started out way too fast. So there's kind of a dotted line here of my target pace that I was trying to go. And then you can see that I started out really fast, so I got really carried away with adrenaline. And then pretty soon I started getting slower, and then I started going above the line, and I started staying above the line. So what you can see here is I started out too fast. I basically blew up and had to slow up and go down until I just kicked it up and got home.
So water stop there?
Actually, this is a turnaround, so which is great. So we see something weird here. We want to know, what is this? Why did I slow down and go to a 9-minute pace? Well, this happens to be, I think this was Rotary Lights or Jingle Bell, one of the two, where we're doing the turnaround and heading back. So, possibly. So basically this shows where I actually raced this quite poorly, and I lost time on this race because I didn't do it right. Now if you look at just my average time, you would never know that. You'd have to start looking at my first mile split, second mile split, third mile split to really understand what happened. You can also see my pacing isn't very good. I'm kind of going up and down, up and down. Part of that is I'm just so far beyond beat up from that first mile that I can't hold my pace. I keep wanting to go faster, but every time I look at my watch, I speed up, and then my body slows down, and I try to speed up. So being able to look at your race results help you figure out what you did wrong and then do it better the next time. So this is the Garmin Training Center, which gives you some nice drafting. You can put runs, bikes in there, and be able to see everything. So here I am just showing my pacing, but I could bring in my heart rate, I could bring in my elevation, and look at those things. But since this is pretty much a flat course, the elevation doesn't change much.
I've got the Garmin 305, but it varies a lot. You know,
You can smooth it out. So with the training center, there's a button on top which is basically a smooth button.
Okay.
If you click on that, it's basically taking a running average of a couple seconds. Otherwise, yes, the data points, especially if your GPS is not hooked in really tight, are going to be really, really funny.
I typically have to average it per mile, just to pick 9.
Right. It's usually pretty accurate. So usually, if you look down and you have instantaneous speed, you're usually where you should be. But it depends on what GPS tool you have. The newer watches are better. So every generation becomes more accurate and does a better job. Also, the slower you get, the less accurate it is, because it's actually looking at circles, and when these circles overlap and you're going kind of slow, it can't really calculate too well the difference. When the circles are spread out, it does a really good job of calculating the speed. So if you're climbing a hill really slow, you may get some weird numbers, but if you're going 20 miles an hour on the bike, you're very, very accurate. But yeah, that's a great question, but if you look for the smoothing, that does help. So this is WKO. I had a really hard time trying to figure out how to show this tool, but it basically allows you to dig into every bit of information you have on the bike, from GPS, power, heart rate. So the yellow line is GPS, orange is elevation, red is heart rate, blue is miles per hour, and green is, yellow is watts. So this is my yellow with watts of what I'm doing. And this is a time trial of Granddad's Bluff last year. So this is basically as much pain as I can take for a little under 9 minutes. But it's really cool if you start digging into it, which we really don't have time, but you can take small segments to see how well I did on the steep point of not getting too far behind and hurting myself too much with my heart rate, versus you can see I'm jumping a lot as I start hitting, going around the Alpine, and start hitting these steep, small hills where I'm really hammering it, and then taking it a little easier in the downhill and then hammering it again, trying to finish. So it's really instructive to dig down and see how your power distribution is, how your heart rate distribution is, and a lot of other things. But again, it's really hard to show on the projector how useful it is. You can also look at your bike rides and see how long you did and the training stress score and then the intensity. So you can see here I was above my threshold, here I was only at 60% of my threshold, and you can basically see, am I doing all hard rides, am I adding in some just easy endurance rides, and what's going on. And that, again, there's also graphs where you can look per week, per day, they add up the different stress. This graph here really helps you figure out if you're peaking and how much power to weight you have, and if it's getting better, worse, and it just keeps track as you lose weight, gain strength, and lose strength. So for example, this is last year. Normally in triathlons, you only care about the 5-minute and 20-minute power. You can see I peaked very well for San Diego, and then I got injured and really didn't peak well for when I raced Got Energy. And you could say a similar process where I peaked and then wasn't able to train and basically lost a lot of fitness. So this allows you to really see if you're getting ready for your A races or not. And it's a good way of measuring how you're doing. All right, and then finally we have the VDOT score. This is, again, a lot of numbers. You basically take a 5K, a 10K, a half marathon, you throw it in here, it generates your threshold pacing, your marathon pace, your easy pace, and you can just use that in GPS, and then as you get faster or slower, you just punch those numbers in again and it recalculates. So if you drop 50 seconds off your 5K pace, your quarter miles and half miles are going to get a little faster. And it just allows you to not run your interval pacing too fast. Because some people go, well, I'm going to do a 5K and I want to run a 19-minute race, so I'm going to run at, what, 5:20s, 5:50s, 6s? I mean, it's kind of hard to know what your intervals should be for what you want to do and what your body can handle. And running is one of the most destructive ways, especially that speed, high tempo working. So being able to have something that keeps you in the zone where you are getting better, but not so much that you're stressing your body out and getting injuries is really helpful. So I usually print something like this out in my fridge and make sure I don't go any faster than it tells me. All right, that's just about everything. Do we have any questions?
What do you do about temperature and humidity with power in the summer?
So you got a really hot, humid day, or you get very
I will usually drop my power a little bit. It really depends what I'm trying to do. So I know I'm affected very heavily by humidity and heat. I dehydrate very fast. So if I am going to do something, I will definitely try to do it in a cooler part of the day, or I will make sure that I'm very hydrated and very able to handle the intensity that I'm going to do. But yeah, the weather is something, especially racing, you're going to have to drop these numbers down quite a bit just to be able to handle it. But that's something that's during training you're going to figure out what you can handle in those high temperatures.
somebody have a chart for that?
They have some charts that I've seen, but none of them that are, you can just punch a number and say, okay, I should be 5% less. It's really how does your body handle it, how well are you acclimated to the heat. So if you've done a bunch of training, you're acclimated, and you have that extra blood volume to keep yourself cool, you can actually train harder. But if you've been training in 60-degree temperature and you go race 85 degrees and humid and you're not acclimated, you're never going to have a chance, and you're going to blow up without really dropping your power. So
Would
that's
you
kind
almost
of,
pay more attention to your heart rate then?
well, I would say no, because you're going to get dehydrated and your heart rate's going to be gone anyway, and it's going to be way off the chart. I find pacing, I've not been good at pacing with my heart rate, mainly because the adrenaline on the race, everything, my heart rate is pretty much worthless for me. Some people that have their heart rate be a little more standard and not affected by everything, it works better for them. For me, I have a very high heart rate, a very low resting heart rate, and it just changes all the time. But it depends on what works best for yourself.
How much of a gain did you get when you went all techie from?
Well, that's hard to say because I can't measure myself
When you
before.
started adding your watt meter, how much faster did you look?
Lots.
I mean-
Well, so I decided, initially I bought race wheels when I first started racing triathlons, and I was like, all right, that's got to be the fastest. And then I started finding out that I was doing a horrible job on the run. I was just dying on the run. On the bike, I would pass everybody, and then half of those people I passed would pass me on the run, and I was like, man, I'm a horrible runner. What can I do to get faster running? And I'd work on running, and nothing would happen. And then I had a race where I actually had some injuries. I was like, all right, I'm going to take it a little easier on the bike so I can run. And I had an awesome run. I'm like, wow, what happened? And then I got a power meter and sold those race wheels, and I got quite a bit faster that next season. So the first season I got a power meter, I probably gained probably close to 50 watts, which is a pretty big jump. It wasn't just from peak to peak, but I saw just a huge improvement. And once I started looking at how I was racing and how poorly I was actually putting the power I had on the whole bike course, how I was wasting a lot on the first part of the ride and then dying at the end, or putting way too much on the climbs and then being fatigued for the run, it made a huge difference. So I would say that was the most beneficial thing I've done racing, is get a GPS running watch so that my pacing was consistent, and then getting a power meter. Much better than any other gear that I bought.
Any thoughts on types of power meters?
Sure. I have just the power meter that fits in the wheel by Cyclops. It works great. It's bulletproof. I can switch it between.
Isn't that the top of the line and the best one to get?
It's not the best.
Okay.
So it works great, but you're stuck to a wheel. So I got it because I didn't have a lot of cash to buy 2 power meters for my road bike and my tri bike. So I got a wheel that was bulletproof. It wasn't a super fast wheel, but I could put a wheel cover on it for triathlon, and I could switch between the bikes in 2 minutes. I would like to probably get a different power tap that would be either crank-based or pedal-based, like the Vector system, which allows you to switch between bikes, but allows you to use any wheel. So being able to use a disc wheel or a tri-spoke or a deep dish back wheel, depending on the conditions, can give you a big benefit. And if you're tied to one wheel, you just have your one wheel. So it kind of depends what you want to pay and what you want to use it for. So you can either get the crank-based, like the Quarks or the SRMs, or you can get the wheel-based, or there's some things with the pedals coming out, hopefully this year. It
Save
didn't come
them
out
for 2
last year. I still want to get one, but we'll see if they come out and actually work. But yeah, they're supposed to be
Pedal
newer.
bases, is that on the arm, a strain gauge on the arm or something?
So the Vector is actually a strain gauge on the pedal itself, but they're having all kinds of technical difficulties.
Okay.
There's supposed to be one that I saw an article a while ago that was actually on the crank arm, and then there's like the corks that are actually on the crank itself, built into that, and the SRMs and stuff like that. But depending what you want, they're both a similar price to get one crank-based or wheel-based. It's just depending if you want to use different wheels or if you have multiple bikes you want to use it on.
Yeah.
So,
In my comes to wheelbase one translated into power, I understand how to get to speed, but also determine.
so it's strain gauges and picking up the acceleration. I can't explain the science, but
Well, it's
they're
still tied
supposed
into the crank, isn't it?
no, no.
It's the difference, there's a strain gauge between your pod and the wheel itself. So if you think about the pod and the wheel, it's having a bit of float, there's a strain gauge between the two. So it's actually theoretically the most accurate.
Yeah, they've
In
done.
practice,
Yes.
it's a different story.
Yes. So there is a problem where the power can change during the ride. So some technologies you have to recalibrate. So like the corks, you pedal backwards and kind of recalibrate it to neutral because you do get a little bit of drift. For example, mine, every time I stop pedaling for a couple seconds, my head unit recalibrates to 0, and I have it just automatically set, so it recalibrates all the time, and I feel pretty confident that the power I feel right now and in an hour are going to be pretty similar. Now, is it perfect? There's no really easy way to tell. They've done a lot of tests between them, and there's usually not much of a difference, 1%, 2%, nothing that you can really notice usually. So, yeah, it's hard to say. Any other questions?
Do you use any books at all or resources to learn about training with power?
Yes, if Training with Power, Allen and Hunt have their their Power Bible book, which is awesome. It goes in and explains, especially they use the WKO tool and dig down into it and explain more than you'd ever know. I had to read it a couple times to really understand what they're talking about. Joel Friegel has just put out a much more condensed, well not condensed, but kind of Cliff Note version of that book, which does a great job of explaining why and how, but they don't go as in depth. And then there's awesome blogs, just a ton of information out there. But there's a ton of information to understand. You can just use a power meter to just do pacing and intervals and racing and not really look at the data that much. It's kind of the first step, and then you can start digging in and kind of understanding the first basics, and then you get into your power quadrants of how hard you're pushing, how fast you're spinning. It's unlimited how deep you can go into to really understand how well you're and how efficiently you're on the bike. So, but yeah, there's a couple of really good books out there.
Back to the bike, I guess one question I had, you talked about the difference between a tubular frame and an aero frame and the percent drag reduction. What about placement of water bottles?
Great question.
Behind the seat? versus on the frame?
Depends. So every bike manufacturer has done all kinds of studies to show what is perfect. In most cases, they say right between your arms is the best position because it fills that hole up and makes this air, instead of circulating and getting stuck in an eddy here, it pushes it out and around. So they've actually done studies where a water bottle here makes you go faster. They've also shown that right behind you, if it's really tight up to you, there's basically dead air there, and that really doesn't affect much. But then if you have two water bottles, you're starting to get out into the airflow and you can start affecting it. They've also done studies in the middle where some round frames, it's supposed to make it faster. In most cases, it doesn't. But yeah, you got to play around, and reading all the information gives you 20 different sides to it. So mainly, the least amount of things you can have in your frame, the better it's going to be. So if you can have one water bottle right here, maybe another one in back, you're probably going to be better than if you have a couple in the frame. Now there's some bikes that have the integrated ones in the frame that actually make it as aerodynamic. as possible, and those are good. And then there's a lot of different ones. We can get pretty big ones in front. So yeah, it's really hard to say, and every frame is different and has a little different aerodynamics. So you can't just say one position is perfect for everybody. Anything else? Sure.
Do you want to go into the value difference of going into high-tech compared to the length of the race and how much you're going to gain from that dollar spent?
Wow, I don't know how to really rate that. Definitely the longer the race, you make more mistakes. So if a bike is 50% of your average race and you're going to be biking for 5.5 hours, there's a lot of time to do something dumb. To start out too hard, to push too hard in the hills, and the more time you have on the run, which is usually around 35% of the time, if you're talking 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, then everything you do on the bike before that is incredibly important, because even small mistakes that you do something for half an hour will come and show up 3-4 hours later when you're out of energy, out of glycogen, all kinds of different things that are really going to hurt you. So definitely the longer the race, the more important of that perfect pacing or that really good pacing is. For a sprint, you can go as hard as you can and you're probably going to make it. It's going to really hurt, but you're not going to lose too much time. But with a half Ironman and Ironman, you can lose hours compared to just minutes. But mainly, technology is for training and racing, so just because you're doing a short race, you're putting in a lot of hours training, so if you're training smarter, you're going to see that benefit in a shorter race too. Anything else? All right. Thanks, and